desperate rancher bought a cheap land and discovered a wild mountain black woman living there. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as creditors loaded Theo Calloway's cattle onto wagons. His last dozen head of livestock disappeared one by one while townspeople gathered to watch. Whispers followed him wherever he walked. Another Calloway failure. Third generation of losers. Theo pulled his hat low and trudged toward Martha Goodwin's inn. His stomach had been empty since yesterday. The kind woman behind the counter took one look at his face and set down a plate of eggs without asking for payment. She leaned closer and spoke quietly. There was land for sale up in the mountains, cheap land. Nobody wanted it on account of some old stories. Cursed, they said, nothing but rocks and rattlesnakes. The land office clerk shook his head when Theo inquired about the mountain property. 500 acres for $50 seemed too good to be true. The clerk warned him twice. Bad soil, no water, strange things happened up there. Folks who went exploring came back spooked. Theo counted out his last bills. $50 was all that stood between him and complete ruin. The deed felt light in his hands as he walked outside. 2 days later, his horse picked carefully up the narrow mountain trail. The terrain looked harsh from below, but hidden valleys opened between the peaks. Green grass grew thick in sheltered spots. Clear streams ran down rocky slopes. This land was anything but worthless. He made camp near a natural spring and explored the surrounding area. Someone had been here recently. Vegetable rows grew in neat lines behind a stand of pine trees. Stone markers lined well-worn paths. Boot prints in the mud were too small to be his. On the third morning, Theo spotted movement on a high ridge. A figure watched him from the rocks above. When he looked again, the person had vanished. He climbed toward the spot but found only windswept stone. The discovery came by accident when he followed a deer trail around a massive boulder. A homestead had been carved directly into the mountainside. Gardens cascaded down terrace levels. A stone chimney rose from what appeared to be solid rock. Water flowed through carefully constructed channels. A woman emerged from the shadows holding a crossbow. She was black and moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this mountain. Her clothes were well made and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She spoke one word: leave. Theo raised his hand slowly. He owned this land now, but something told him that legal papers meant nothing up here. This woman held secrets about his property. His survival might depend on understanding what he had stumbled into. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the valley below. Multiple riders were heading up the trail toward his camp. The woman with the crossbow melted back into the rocks like smoke. Theo scrambled down the mountainside toward his camp as hoofbeats grew louder. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line. The leader wore an expensive coat despite the mountain heat. The man dismounted with practiced ease. Silas Trent owned half the businesses in town and had his fingers in every profitable venture for 50 miles. His smile never reached his eyes. Silas congratulated Theo on his land purchase. Word traveled fast in small territories. He had come to make an offer out of Christian kindness. $150 for the worthless rocks Theo had foolishly bought. Theo kept his face neutral. 3 times what he paid seemed generous for cursed land. Too generous. Silas pressed harder when Theo hesitated. The mountain was dangerous. Wild animals, rough weather, no place for a man down on his luck. The 2 riders behind Silas never dismounted. Their hands rested casually on their gun belts. Theo recognized the type. Men who solved problems with violence when words failed. Silas pulled out a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. The money would solve all of Theo's problems, pay his debts, give him a fresh start somewhere else. All he had to do was sign over the deed. Theo asked for time to consider the offer. Silas's smile tightened. 24 hours. These mountains could be deadly for a man camping alone. Accidents happened to folks who stayed too long. The 3 riders disappeared down the trail in a cloud of dust. Theo waited until the sound faded completely before climbing back toward the hidden homestead. The woman emerged from a different direction entirely. She had circled around to watch the entire encounter. Her name was Zahara Fontaine. She had lived on this mountain for 8 years without anyone knowing. The crossbow remained in her hands but no longer pointed at his chest. She asked what Silas had offered him. Theo told her about the money. Zahara nodded like she expected as much. Rich men did not ride into the wilderness to help struggling ranchers. They came for profit. She led him deeper into her mountain sanctuary. Hidden gardens stretched across multiple terraces. Root cellars had been carved into solid rock. A workshop contained tools and equipment that must have taken years to accumulate. This woman had not just survived alone. She had thrived. Zahara showed him surveyor marks carved into trees throughout the area, fresh cuts made within the past month. Someone had been mapping the land without his knowledge. The marks followed specific patterns that traced underground water sources. She produced a leather journal filled with detailed observations, weather patterns, animal migrations, seasonal changes in the streams and springs. Her handwriting was clear and precise. This woman could read and write better than most men in town. Theo asked how she knew about surveying. Zahara studied his face for a long moment before answering. Her grandmother had taught her to read the land, to understand what signs meant, and how to survive when survival seemed impossible. She opened the journal to a hand-drawn map of the entire mountain range. Every stream, cave, and hidden valley had been marked with scientific precision. Red X marks indicated underground springs. Blue lines showed year-round water sources. The mountain sat on top of a massive aquifer. Railroad companies needed water for their steam engines. Lots of water. The transcontinental expansion had stalled in this region because reliable sources were scarce. Whoever controlled this mountain controlled the key to the railroad's progress. Zahara had been intercepting documents left behind by survey crews. Most men assumed a woman living alone could not read technical reports. They discarded papers without thinking. She collected every scrap and studied them carefully. The real surveyors had never reached this mountain. Their reports indicated they turned back 50 miles south due to Apache activity. Someone else had been making those fresh marks on the trees. Someone pretending to work for the railroad. Silas Trent was running a land swindle. He used fake survey reports to convince owners their property was worthless. Bought cheap land with fabricated curse stories and mysterious accidents. Then sold the same parcels to legitimate railroad companies at enormous profits. Zahara had suspected the deception for months. Theo's arrival confirmed her theory. Silas moved too quickly. Real business deals took time. Fake ones required speed before victims could investigate. She asked if Theo planned to sell. The money would solve his immediate problems, but Silas would make 10 times that amount from the railroad. Meanwhile, she would lose her home and probably her freedom. A black woman living alone would face questions she could not answer safely. Theo looked around at the remarkable homestead carved from raw mountain stone. This woman had accomplished something extraordinary. She had turned worthless land into a sanctuary through intelligence and determination. Everything Silas claimed was impossible. They heard horses approaching again before either could speak. More riders this time, at least 6 men judging by the sound. Silas had returned with reinforcements. Zahara moved toward her weapons cache with practiced efficiency. She knew every hiding spot and escape route on the mountain, but running would only delay the inevitable. Sooner or later she would have to make a stand. Theo made his choice. He would not sell to Silas Trent. Whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 riders emerged from the tree line with the local sheriff in the lead. Silas rode beside him wearing the expression of a concerned citizen. The other men spread out in a semicircle around Theo's camp. Their intentions were clear without words. Sheriff Hawkins dismounted slowly. He had known Theo since childhood, but his face showed no warmth now. Reports had reached town about dangerous vagrants hiding in the mountains. Folks were concerned about fugitive slaves and other criminals using the remote terrain as shelter. Theo stood his ground. This was his land legally purchased and properly deeded. The sheriff nodded, but explained that ownership came with responsibilities. Harboring wanted persons was a serious crime. Even unknowing assistance could result in prosecution. Silas added his voice to the sheriff's concerns. Good citizens had obligations to report suspicious activity. The mountains were no place for lawless elements. Public safety demanded thorough investigation of any rumors. The sheriff asked if Theo had encountered anyone unusual during his stay. Theo met his gaze steadily and said he had seen no one. The lie came easier than expected. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Silas suggested a complete search of the property. His men knew the terrain and could conduct a proper sweep. Any evidence of trespassers should be documented and reported to territorial authorities. The sheriff agreed readily. Thea watched the men fan out across his land. Zahara had vanished completely, but her homestead remained hidden among the rocks above. Discovery would mean capture or worse. Her freedom depended on staying invisible until the search ended. The riders spent 2 hours combing through valleys and ravines. They found Theo's camp, his horse, and nothing else. The mountain kept its secrets well. Silas grew increasingly frustrated as his men returned empty-handed. One rider reported strange markings on trees throughout the area, survey symbols and boundary markers that seemed fresh. The sheriff examined the cuts and agreed they looked recent. Someone had been working this land without permission. Silas seized on this discovery. Illegal surveying was a federal offense when it involved potential railroad routes. The territorial government took such violations seriously. Theo could face charges if he allowed unauthorized activity on his property. The sheriff warned Theo to report any future incidents immediately. Failure to cooperate with federal investigations carried severe penalties. The territory was changing rapidly, and old ways of handling problems would no longer be tolerated. After the riders departed, Theo climbed toward Zahara's hidden sanctuary. She emerged from a cave system he had never noticed. Her knowledge of the mountain's secrets ran deeper than he had imagined. Every rock formation held potential shelter or escape route. Zahara led him through passages that connected multiple cave chambers. Her grandmother had taught her that survival meant always having another way out. The underground network extended for miles in all directions. A person could travel unseen across the entire mountain range. She showed him the history written in her careful handwriting. Her grandmother had been born into slavery in Georgia, escaped during the chaos of war, and traveled west with other refugees. They had found this mountain after months of running and decided to make it home. The old woman had possessed remarkable skills. She could read weather patterns in cloud formations, track water sources by studying plant growth, navigate by stars, and predict seasonal changes with uncanny accuracy. All of this knowledge had been passed down through careful teaching. Zahara opened a wooden chest filled with documents and maps, letters from railroad executives discussing water rights and land acquisition, technical reports about geological surveys and mineral deposits, legal papers detailing territorial expansion plans. She had been collecting intelligence for years. Her grandmother had taught her that information was the most valuable currency. Knowledge could purchase safety when money failed. Understanding the intentions of powerful men provided protection that weapons alone could not guarantee. The railroad companies faced a critical shortage. Steam engines required massive amounts of water for boiler operations. The transcontinental route had been planned through this region, specifically because geological surveys indicated major aquifer systems beneath the mountains. Zahara had mapped every spring, stream, and underground source across thousands of acres. Her documentation was more complete than any official survey. She understood the water table better than any government engineer. This knowledge made her invaluable to the right people. She had been corresponding secretly with legitimate railroad representatives through Martha Goodwin's assistance. The innkeeper had connections throughout the territory and had helped establish communication channels. Letters traveled slowly but regularly between the mountain and distant offices. Zahara pulled out the most recent correspondence. Railroad executives were growing suspicious about delays in land acquisition. Survey teams reported conflicting information about water availability. Some properties had been purchased by unknown parties who refused to negotiate development rights. The letters revealed Silas Trent's deception in stark detail. He had been impersonating federal surveyors and railroad representatives across multiple territories. His land swindle operation had cheated dozens of property owners out of valuable resources. The real railroad companies knew nothing about his activities. Zahara had documentation proving the fraud, forged credentials, fake survey reports, and fabricated geological assessments. She had been building a case while remaining completely hidden from view. Her grandmother's lessons about patience and preparation had served her well. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. More riders were coming up the mountain trail. This time, they were not leaving anything to chance. Silas had returned with enough men to search every inch of the property. Zahara gathered her most important documents into a leather portfolio. The evidence of Silas's crimes and her own legal preparations would be needed soon. The time for hiding was ending whether they were ready or not. 12 men on horseback surrounded Theo's camp in the pre-dawn darkness. Silas had brought overwhelming force this time. The sheriff rode with 2 men wearing federal marshal badges. Their authority extended beyond territorial law into matters of national security. Lanterns cast dancing shadows as the riders dismounted. Silas directed the search with military precision. Every rock formation would be examined, every cave explored. No hiding place would escape scrutiny. The mountain would surrender its secrets today. Marshal Davidson announced his authority to search for fugitive slaves and federal criminals. Railroad expansion was a matter of national importance. Anyone interfering with legitimate survey operations faced serious charges. Cooperation was mandatory, not optional. Theo stood beside his cold campfire, watching the systematic search begin. Men spread across the mountainside with lanterns and ropes. They moved like hunters who had cornered dangerous prey. Escape seemed impossible against such numbers. Zahara emerged from the rocks above carrying her leather portfolio. She walked down the slope with steady dignity despite a dozen weapons turning in her direction. Her chin remained high and her step never faltered. She had chosen to face her fate rather than cower in hiding. The men stared in shocked silence. They had expected to flush out a desperate fugitive. Instead, they found a woman who carried herself like royalty. Her clothes were well made, and her bearing spoke of education and refinement. Nothing about her matched their assumptions. Marshal Davidson recovered first and demanded identification papers. Zahara opened her portfolio and extracted a thick bundle of documents. Her movements were deliberate and confident. She possessed something more valuable than weapons or gold. She had truth. The first document was a geological survey more detailed than anything the government possessed. Hand-drawn maps showed every water source across the mountain range. Technical annotations demonstrated scientific knowledge that few educated men could match. The marshals examined the papers with growing amazement. Zahara spoke clearly about her 8 years of research. She had documented seasonal variations in water flow, mapped underground aquifer systems, calculated volume capacity for industrial usage. Her data would be invaluable to any railroad company seeking reliable water sources. Silas interrupted angrily. This woman was clearly a runaway slave living illegally on federal land. Her supposed documents were forgeries designed to confuse legitimate authorities. She should be arrested immediately and returned to her rightful owners. Zahara handed Marshal Davidson a second set of papers. official correspondence with railroad executives in Chicago and San Francisco, letters discussing water rights purchases and geological assessments. The documents bore corporate seals and executive signatures that could not be counterfeited. The marshal read carefully, while Silas grew increasingly agitated. These were not the papers of a fugitive slave. The letters discussed complex business arrangements with someone clearly educated in engineering and law. Railroad executives did not negotiate with criminals or runaways. Thea stepped forward and declared his partnership with Zahara. She had been living on his legally purchased land with his full knowledge and consent. Any water rights she had negotiated were done with his approval as the property owner. They stood together as legitimate business partners. Silas exploded in fury. The whole situation was an elaborate deception. Federal marshals were being manipulated by criminals and their accomplices. He demanded immediate arrests and seizure of all fraudulent documents. His voice carried the hysteria of a man watching his plans collapse. Marshal Davidson ignored Silas and continued reading. The correspondence revealed disturbing information about unauthorized surveying in the territory. Someone had been impersonating federal officials and railroad representatives. The legitimate companies were filing complaints about fraudulent land deals. Zahara produced her final set of documents, detailed records of Silas Trent's activities over the past 2 years, forged survey reports, fake federal credentials, property deeds obtained through deception and intimidation. She had been building a case while everyone assumed she was illiterate and powerless. The sound of additional horses echoed from the valley below. Martha Goodwin appeared leading 3 more riders. A territorial lawyer rode beside her along with 2 men wearing genuine railroad company uniforms. The cavalry had arrived at the perfect moment. Martha dismounted with the satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning had finally paid off. She had been coordinating communications between Zahara and the outside world for months. Every letter had been transmitted through her network of contacts across the territory. The railroad representatives introduced themselves as investigators sent to examine fraudulent activities in the region. They had been working with territorial authorities to identify the source of forged documents and illegal land transactions. Zahara's correspondence had provided crucial evidence for their investigation. Attorney Morrison carried warrants for Silas Trent's arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and impersonation of federal officials. The evidence had been building for weeks through multiple complaints from railroad companies and territorial land offices. Today's confrontation would end with justice rather than intimidation. Sheriff Hawkins found himself in an uncomfortable position. He had been manipulated into supporting a criminal enterprise. The fake marshals were revealed as hired guns with no legal authority. His cooperation with Silas now appeared as either corruption or incompetence. Silas made one final desperate attempt to seize control. He shouted about property rights and federal jurisdiction. His hired men should arrest everyone for interfering with legitimate business operations. The mountain belonged to American citizens, not to criminals and their protectors. Marshal Davidson ordered Silas and his men to surrender their weapons. The game was over and everyone knew it. Justice had arrived with proper documentation and legal authority. 8 years of patient preparation had defeated 2 years of criminal deception. Zahara closed her portfolio and looked across the assembled crowd. She had gambled everything on this moment. Her freedom, her home, and her future all depended on truth defeating lies. The mountain had finally revealed its most precious secret. The territorial courthouse in Silver Ridge buzzed with activity as news of Silas Trent's arrest spread throughout the region. Dozens of property owners who had been swindled came forward with their own stories of fraudulent land deals. The scope of his criminal enterprise became clear as victims testified about threats, forged documents, and stolen property. Judge Harrison presided over the proceedings with stern efficiency. Evidence mounted daily as investigators uncovered falsified survey reports across 3 territories. Railroad companies provided documentation showing they had never authorized Silas's activities. His network of hired intimidators faced charges ranging from fraud to assault. Zahara sat beside Attorney Morrison as he presented her case for legal recognition of water rights. Her detailed geological surveys impressed federal land commissioners who had never seen such thorough documentation. 8 years of careful observation had produced scientific data that surpassed government studies. The railroad executives examined her maps with obvious admiration. Chicago and Northern Railroad had been searching for reliable water sources along their proposed western route for 2 years. Zahara's research solved their most pressing logistical challenge while providing exact locations for optimal water access. Negotiations proceeded swiftly once her legal status was established. The railroad needed immediate access to spring water for their advanced construction crews. Zahara's detailed knowledge of seasonal variations and flow rates made her an invaluable consultant for long-term planning. Her expertise commanded premium compensation. Theo watched the legal proceedings with amazement. 3 weeks earlier, he had been a failed rancher facing complete financial ruin. Now he sat as an equal partner in negotiations with major corporations. His association with Zahara had transformed worthless mountain land into the key to railroad expansion. The water rights agreement exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Chicago and Northern paid $50,000 for 10-year access rights to the mountain springs. Additional compensation would be provided for ongoing geological consulting and maintenance of water delivery systems. Both partners would receive equal shares of all payments. Sheriff Hawkins faced his own reckoning as territorial investigators examined his cooperation with Silas's criminal activities. His defense of ignorance carried little weight given the obvious nature of the deception. The territorial governor demoted him to deputy status and assigned a new sheriff to clean up the corruption. Martha Goodwin's role as secret coordinator earned praise from territorial authorities. Her network of contacts had enabled communication between Zahara and legitimate railroad representatives, while maintaining complete secrecy about the mountain hideout. The governor offered her a position as territorial communications coordinator. Word of Zahara's remarkable story spread through newspaper reports that reached readers across the Western Territories. A self-educated woman who had mapped an entire mountain range while living in complete isolation became a symbol of individual achievement against impossible odds. Her scientific accomplishments drew attention from universities and geological societies. The town of Silver Ridge experienced dramatic changes as legitimate railroad construction began. New businesses opened to serve the influx of workers and supplies. Property values increased as the area transformed from a remote frontier outpost into a crucial transportation hub. Economic prosperity replaced the atmosphere of suspicion and decline. Theo used his share of the railroad money to pay off all debts with substantial funds remaining for investment. His reputation changed overnight from village failure to successful businessman. Former creditors who had seized his cattle now approached him with partnership proposals and investment opportunities. Zahara faced more complex decisions about her future. The isolation that had protected her for 8 years was ending as railroad construction brought hundreds of workers into the mountains. Her secret sanctuary would soon be surrounded by industrial activity and permanent settlements. She chose to embrace the changes rather than flee to new hiding places. Legal recognition of her property rights provided security she had never possessed. Her expertise in water management and geological assessment created opportunities for legitimate business ventures throughout the expanding territory. Construction of a proper road to the mountain began within weeks of the contract signing. Zahara supervised the project to ensure minimal disruption to the natural water systems she had spent years studying. Her recommendations guided placement of buildings and equipment to preserve the delicate ecological balance. The first railroad crews arrived in late autumn as leaves turned gold across the mountainsides. Workers treated Zahara with respect that bordered on reverence. Her reputation as the woman who had mapped the unmappable preceded her arrival to oversee water distribution systems. Thea established a permanent residence in the valley below Zahara's mountain retreat. Their business partnership required regular coordination, but both valued their independence. The arrangement allowed collaboration without forcing either person to abandon their preferred lifestyle. Letters arrived weekly from railroad executives, government officials, and scientific organizations. Zahara's geological expertise was in demand across the Western Territories as expansion accelerated. She carefully selected consulting projects that interested her while maintaining primary focus on her mountain home. The territorial legislature passed special recognition honoring Zahara's contributions to regional development. Her documentation of water resources had enabled economic growth that would benefit thousands of settlers. The formal acknowledgement marked a dramatic change in official attitudes toward capabilities of women and minorities. Martha's Inn expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors seeking meetings with the famous mountain surveyor. Business travelers, scientists, and curiosity seekers created demand for additional rooms and services. The quiet frontier establishment transformed into a bustling hub of territorial commerce. Winter approached with construction crews preparing permanent camps throughout the mountain valleys. Spring would bring the massive effort to lay track across terrain that everyone had considered impossible just months earlier. Zahara's maps would guide every mile of the historic project. The transformation was complete, but the future held unlimited possibilities. 6 months of spring construction had transformed the remote mountain wilderness into a thriving industrial center. Steam engines whistled through valleys that had known only wind and wildlife for centuries. The Chicago and Northern Railroad's western expansion rolled forward on schedule, thanks to the abundant water sources that Zahara had mapped with scientific precision. Zahara stood on her expanded stone terrace watching the controlled chaos below. Her mountain retreat had grown into a sophisticated research station, complete with laboratory equipment, and a library that drew visitors from across the territories. The isolation she had once required for survival had evolved into the solitude necessary for serious scientific work. Her botanical gardens cascaded down multiple levels, where she cultivated native plants for medicinal and agricultural research. University professors traveled hundreds of miles to study her documentation of high-altitude flora. The woman who had once hidden from all human contact now hosted some of the most educated minds in the Western Territories. Theo climbed the familiar path carrying mail and supply orders from town. Their business partnership had evolved into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared success. He managed the commercial aspects of their water rights enterprise, while she focused on technical consulting and research projects. The railroad construction had exceeded all projected timelines. Zahara's detailed knowledge of seasonal water variations allowed engineers to plan operations with unprecedented accuracy. Her predictions about weather patterns and geological conditions proved reliable to the day. The railroad executives considered her the most valuable consultant they had ever employed. Letters from scientific societies arrived weekly with requests for lectures and research collaborations. The Geological Survey of California wanted her to map water resources throughout the Sierra Nevada range. The Territorial Agricultural Commission sought her expertise on irrigation systems for the expanding farming settlements. She accepted only projects that aligned with her interests and values. Sustainable development that preserved natural systems took priority over pure profit. Her grandmother's teachings about living in harmony with the land guided every professional decision. Progress should enhance rather than destroy the environment. The town of Silver Ridge had quadrupled in size as railroad construction drew workers, merchants, and settlers seeking opportunities in the expanding territory. Martha's Inn anchored a growing business district that included banks, shops, and professional offices. The economic transformation exceeded everyone's most optimistic predictions. Zahara had become the unofficial expert on territorial development. Government officials consulted her about land use policies and resource management. Her combination of scientific knowledge and practical experience made her uniquely qualified to balance competing interests of progress and preservation. The legal precedent established by her case had encouraged other marginalized people to assert their property rights and business interests. Several freed slaves had established successful enterprises using her victory as legal justification. Women across the territory cited her example when demanding recognition of their capabilities and contributions. Theo's reputation had undergone a complete reversal. The failed rancher who had bought worthless land in desperation was now considered one of the shrewdest businessmen in the territory. His willingness to partner with Zahara rather than exploit her knowledge had proven more profitable than any traditional approach. Construction of the transcontinental rail line through their mountain passes would be completed by year's end. The economic impact would extend far beyond their immediate region as trade routes shifted and new markets opened. Their water rights agreement included percentage participation in all future railroad revenues from the mountain crossing. Silas Trent began serving a 20-year prison sentence after additional fraud charges were filed in 3 territories. His criminal network had been completely dismantled, with victims recovering millions of dollars in stolen property and fraudulent payments. Justice had been thorough and comprehensive. Zahara had received offers to relocate to major cities, where her expertise would command even higher compensation. San Francisco business leaders proposed partnerships worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eastern universities offered research positions with unlimited funding and international recognition. She declined every offer that required abandoning her mountain home. This land held her grandmother's memory and 8 years of careful work. No amount of money could replace the sanctuary she had built through determination and intelligence. Success meant expanding her impact while remaining rooted in the place that had sheltered her dreams. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her gardens as she worked among the medicinal plants her grandmother had taught her to cultivate. Thea joined her in the peaceful routine they had established over months of partnership. 2 people who had been dismissed by society had created something remarkable together. Their success proved that dignity and intelligence could triumph over prejudice and greed. The worthless land that nobody wanted had become the foundation for prosperity that benefited hundreds of people. The woman who had been forced to hide her capabilities was now consulted by the most powerful institutions in the territory. Evening approached with the sounds of progress echoing from the valleys below. Train whistles mixed with construction noise, and the voices of workers heading home after another day of building the future. The mountain that had once known only silence now hummed with purposeful activity. Zahara and Theo worked side by side in the garden, where water flowed through channels carved by her own hands. Their partnership had grown from desperate necessity into a model of what was possible when people looked beyond surface appearances to recognize true worth. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.